Thank you all for coming out for our first Science Cafe of the year. So we are Sigma Xi, the National Research Honor Society. Just a quick heads up, in February of 2020 we're going to have a membership drive. If you are a faculty member who's not already a member, who is doing research and presenting that at national conferences, we would definitely like to have you in our ranks. If you are a student who is doing research, we absolutely would like to have you. You can talk to myself, you can talk to one of our other officers or representatives about membership. You have time to figure that out between now and our membership drive. Before we go any further, I'd like to introduce our officers for the 2019-2020 year. David Clark is in charge of our publicity. He's also our emeriti representative. Non-president Darby Carlson is our treasurer. Nick Hobbs is our secretary. Alan Thomas is our vice president. And I am Evan Hill, our president for this year. We have a couple of representatives. Kim Carlson, also not present, is our biology representative. Scott Darbo is our chemistry representative. Jeremy Armstrong is our physics representative. Bob Rysek, psychology department representative. And Janice Steele is our representative at large. So tonight, Dr. Bill Wozniak is going to present for us on a decade's worth of research that he's done with the Nebraska Public State Patrol. Just quick note, a little info about Bill. He's been a faculty member at UNK since 1978. Right. He actually is an original charter member of Sigma Xi chapter here at UNK, not UNK at that point in time. Let's see, Bob Rysek, also an original charter member, as well as David Clark. I don't think anyone else in the room is an original charter member. So, Bill has been a representative in the organization, from what I could find, from 1987 to 1993. Our record keeping is quite suspect in the past. Let's see. From what I've been told, he's played a pivotal role in the early development of our chapter here at this institution. At some point, which I can't figure out when it was, there was a lull in activity. It looks like that happened somewhere between 1997 and 2004. Maybe it was that whole time period, I'm not sure. The records are questionable. But what I understand is that with Bill, former department chair of psychology, Richard Miller, and members of the biology department, we had a reinvigoration, if you will, of the chapter. Was that? Resurrection. Resurrection, reinvigoration. I had another one on there as well. Revived. Right? Okay, all of the above. Resuscitated. So, I know that Bill's been president at least twice. He guesses. I lost count. So, definitely, for sure, between 2007 and 2010, and also in the 2015-16 academic year. So, he's got a long history with the organization. Without further ado, Dr. Wozniak.
I may not deserve that, but I'll take your judgment for later. Let me add to Evan's introduction. A couple things happened when we were resuscitated. One thing was it happened in Kansas, where in fact they started teaching creationism in the school systems, and that raised the ire of many of our biologists. And I also started having meetings in bars, and so that helped us out in that regard. One of them is pretty important. Let me start. This is in my top 10 list of situations that raise fear. I look at my colleagues here. I'm not going to give you some of the things we've had in past science cafes. No super sophisticated statistical analyses, let's see, I listed them all. It's just drawing common sense conclusions, but supporting it with observations. So there's going to be no, ultimately, grand discovery here. It's going to be basically supporting some of the things that make sense. And so if you're looking for a revolutionary moment, I'm afraid you're going to have to find it in your drinks. So about 10 years ago, 2009, I was invited to a meeting by Ken Trent. Ken is not here, but I will talk about Ken quite a bit. I'm going to figure out how to hold this. All right, got it. And it was a meeting with Sherry Morrow, who had an opportunity for the Cove Safety Center, the Nebraska Safety Center. And the opportunity came from the State Patrol. One of the State Patrol troopers, Jamie Balthazar, had the idea that maybe we ought to work with the Safety Center and develop a research program to look at the implementation of reflective materials on State Patrol units. Concern at that time is reflected in this news article. State Patrol officers, about 6 or 10 a year, were being rear-ended while they were on the shoulder of highways, especially interstates. And at those speeds, it typically is fatal for the driver, and many of the State Patrol officers are injured. And basically, what we found is that that's probably the most dangerous part of their job. And Ken Trantham has some data to support that if you're on the shoulder on the interstate or any major highway, it's very, very dangerous. Drivers do not move over, they simply don't slow down, and there's evidence that that's probably the most dangerous part of a police officer's job. 37% line of duty deaths are attributable to accidents on the highway. So it's a concern. In 2009, this is approximately from that, you can see the wreck here of the State Patrol vehicle. And in this case, and in many other cases, the State Patrol vehicle is pulled over on the shoulder with its bar lights on, with all of its strobes on, and yet for some reason the driver will just drive right up the rear end at high speed. So that's a concern. So in 2009, it so happens, FEMA became interested and wrote a long report concerning visibility and conspicuity. I will talk about that in a little bit. I can't say it 10 times in a row fast, but we'll talk about the distinction between that. I think I have a little bit of a demonstration, if the slides work, of the distinction between something that's visible and something that's conspicuous, that draws your attention. So, the initial considerations was a request from the State Patrol, and we were promised a couple things. Well, first of all, the accident rate and the FEMA report, that was unacceptable. One accident, one trooper injured in that kind of an accident was too many. But also, they had plans, and this is one of the lessons from applied research. Their plans, supposedly, they were going to move to all Dodge Chargers and get rid of the Crown Vics, which were the standard vehicles at the time. Then in 2010, the Crown Vics were still sold for another year, and it turns out Chargers were not the only vehicle that the State Patrol was using. So I think that the circumstances of their work it made it a moving target. It made it a moving target. Also, retroreflective markings became available, and they were curious about what was the most visible. I have some samples you can pass around. I'll let the deans play with it first. Blue, red, and white. And what makes retroreflective markings special is that it reflects the light back in the direction of the source of the light that hits it.
So diffuse reflector is basically anything, even like this screen, that reflects light from the light source in all directions. Specular reflectors, like a mirror, reflecting it at what is it, the angle of incidence. Thank you for that wise nod. And retroreflective material reflects it back in the direction of the source of light, which would be very useful for making those vehicles visible. Now, if you'd like me to go into the physics of this, I can. It's magic. Okay. So that's my level of understanding of how this works. And there's going to be another reference to physics, and I'll just say it's magic. All right. Now, what I did, this is where I think the lessons from accident analysis by the NTSB comes into play. And the problem we were confronted with is bring those accidents and the characteristics of the accidents into the laboratory. And there's a problem there, a major problem. The field work, the field situation for an accident has a ton of factors. And NTSB typically has access to, well, in aircraft crashes, the black box, the cockpit recordings, and a variety of things. So they have fairly good data, but with car crashes, there's a ton of other factors that might not be available to the investigators. Nonetheless, what they do is, and by the way, the most recent NTSB study was done with the unfortunate accident of the scuba divers who were killed in the fire in California. And they drew some conclusions because the crew was not following protocol. It was at night, all of the crew members were asleep, and they have to have somebody on watch at night. Didn't happen. And so the fire occurred, and 37 people were killed due to smoke inhalation on that boat. So in this case, they analyze the facts. They draw the conclusions, and here's where we're at in terms of countermeasures, which is a little bit vague, because bringing it into the laboratory, we're working on the best possible countermeasures based on an ill-defined problem. It's a class of problems. It's not one specific problem we're trying to address, but it's an entire class of problems involving state patrol vehicles. And so there's plenty of other variables that we can't bring into the lab. So what, by necessity, we have to do is to reduce the variables we want to study to one or two, and then try to draw a conclusion from that, realizing that there's going to be severe limitations in the kinds of applications we have. So first of all, each case is unique. Each collision with a state patrol vehicle, different circumstances, sometimes at night, sometimes during the day, sometimes in rain, sometimes with an elderly driver or otherwise impaired driver. All of those factors stack up to make it very difficult to draw a general conclusion, which we want to do. And some cases are multi-determinant, where you have poor visibility, plus the procedure was not followed. Potential causes may or may not be present in one instance. Yeah, we're going to look at some others. And then countermeasures. And this is where you get into in communicating this to the general public. Well, I did everything you told me to, and I still crashed. Well, they're not panaceas. That's a problem of public relations and communicating the good science to the general public. All right, here's the terminology. Their vehicles are cruisers. They are troopers. And you can call them officers. I guess they don't mind that. But they do mind it if you talk about the markings on their cruiser as being decorations. They don't like that at all. They're not a birthday cake. Getting into conspicuity versus visibility. I'll have an example in a couple slides. Conspicuity is how a particular object can draw your attention. If it's conspicuous, it has the characteristic of drawing your attention to it, which is a little bit more than visibility. If it's visible, you don't necessarily have to attend to it. I'll have a couple of examples. Also, we'll talk about active versus passive techniques. Turning the lights on, turning the siren on increases conspicuity, but passive techniques would be the markings on the cruiser that in fact might be reflected and it doesn't require to be turned on. And there's even advancements in that nowadays, whereas some sirens are becoming, are utilizing more low frequency sound, which carries further than the higher frequency, and it's more effective in warning people of their moving forward. Chevron versus Battenberg markings, I have an example of that. This was discussed by me with the troopers, and they do not like Battenberg markings, these squares that in fact identify. And each country in Europe has a different coding system for these squares. The coloring coding determines the department they're in and the type of vehicle you're looking at. Our troopers had a nice term for it, clown cars. They do not want to drive a clown car. More in tune with North America are what are called chevron markings. You see these on railroad crossings, on emergency vehicles, and a whole variety of other areas of concern on the highway. Barriers will have chevron markings, and they prefer that, but of course with limitations. They don't want, again, clown cars. To comment on that, I wasn't very sympathetic with the troopers who called Battenberg marked cars clown cars. But then you realize if you walk by a state patrol vehicle, that's their work area, that's their office. So I can understand that they wanted to look cool, which was part of their commentary. Straight line versus echelon parking is relevant to how we're going to do the markings. Simply having markings on the back end isn't sufficient, because when state patrol officers can do a pullover, it's recommended that they do echelon pullovers, so they angle the vehicle a little bit. And if you look at it then, for oncoming traffic, more of the side of the vehicle is visible, so the retro-reflective material will have to be applied to the side as well as the back. This also provides, I imagine, for other activities that they might do on the interstate, provides more protection for the trooper getting out of their car. Having an engine block in between the trooper and a shooter is quite valuable. So I imagine that echelon. The limitation of that is that if there isn't much of a shoulder here or a berm, they can't do that. They have to go to straight line pullovers. And this is generally in their recommended protocol for pullovers. So, what I want to do is talk a little bit about some of the tools that I brought into the situation out of the laboratory. And my little brain saw the similarity between some of these things we do in the lab and some of the things that a driver will do as they're moving down the interstate and possibly facing danger. One is a visual search. We can measure the speed and accuracy of finding a target that's unique in this particular array of X's. There is a unique item in there. And likewise, the similarity of that particular target, I'll point it out if you haven't found it yet, to the background targets, or the distractors, is a determiner of how, in fact, quickly you can find it and accurately. In this case, it's a little bit easier because the O is very different in terms of its features, and we can typically get that much more quickly. Also, I can make the target conspicuous by changing the color. So the conspicuity changes, and in this case, we can also do it with, oops, there's a flashing light. It's a little slow, but that's a notion of an activity that makes it, that you can turn on and makes it conspicuous. All right. Next, change blindness. This is a technique that's been used to look at how conspicuous an element of an image is And change blindness uses a particular technique of showing one image, gray screen, and then another image that has a change due to it. The observation that cognitive psychologists have made is you can make some pretty big changes and people will not notice it. In this case, whoops, there we go. It changes, it loses its agents. You haven't noticed that. So in a sense, it's a demonstration of conspicuity, but how easy it is for something that seems to be quite obviously visible and should be conspicuous. Yet the way we scan the image, whatever that image was supposed to be, it can become relatively invisible to the observer. Okay, so now what we wanted to do is begin the research. I mentioned that this talk is in the top 10 list of the scariest situations I had. Another situation in June of 2009 was this focus group. Jamie Balthazar picked these people, and I think he picked them for their size. They were all 6-something, 200 plus, and they were all armed. So running a focus group with people with sidearms who, by the way, they were all ordered to be there, so they didn't really necessarily volunteer or want to be there. It was a scary situation. However, they were quite willing to talk about safety issues and some of the experiences they had that we can address using markings. One was a police officer said that, in particular, when there is an accident and they're putting out the cones, very dangerous time. And even after the cones are out and they're redirecting traffic, he mentioned that all he had to do was to put his hand out about a foot from his hip, and he could have touched cars going by him at 45, 50 miles an hour. That I remember. In the sense of being on the highway and directing traffic, they were willing to talk about that. Also, for those who do questionnaire research, the colonel had online questionnaire for all of the troopers. The response rate was 100%. When they're ordered to fill out a questionnaire, they do it. And so it confirmed that they saw the great danger in highway operations, and they talked about Seward and East on I-80 as being probably the most dangerous areas in their operation range. Now the goals of all of this came out in terms of 3 goals. Yeah, I don't know if they're contradictory to each other. First of all, conspicuity. You want to have markings that make them noticeable, but not necessarily from every angle. They also wanted a degree of stealth. Some of their operations require that they can't be seen from very far. And then, of course, respectability or coolness. No clown cars. They wanted to look good. Well, it turns out our first study we did, they sent us a number of pictures that look like this. Yeah, I'll read it to you. They weren't very good for the study, but we used it and showed it to students and had them, we timed them and we looked at their error rates to if in fact they were looking at a state patrol vehicle or not. And that preliminary study, the front view, since it has no markings and it just has that rating for pushing vehicles off the highway, they couldn't tell that it was a state patrol vehicle unless they saw the light bar and were able to recognize that. So the front view was slow. Silver vehicles, which is, by the way, they told us they're only going to have white, black, and silver Chargers. And the silver vehicles were the slowest in recognition, probably because the markings really didn't have a lot of contrast with the background. Very easy to observe and notice. Let's see. ID times were slower with increased distance. So we had pictures taken at 5 car lengths, 50 car lengths, and 250 car lengths. And as you increase the distance, of course, they couldn't recognize the NSP vehicle. Here's our, by the way, all of this research, trying to get this into the lab, and I forgot 3 words, on the cheap. We have the contribution of the State Patrol. They gave us access to 3 different used State Patrol vehicles. It had everything in it except weapons and radios. They didn't want us talking to them, I guess. But even so, with all of the electronic equipment, if you parked them for 2 days, the batteries were dead. It was just draining them completely. So we had a battery charger at the center. Now the way we did this is the Battenberg pattern with white reflective material, the chevron pattern, and a control group. So we were looking at recognition times under different conditions. Depending on the pattern and on the color, we compared red to blue to white, and under various different conditions. And there are some more examples of how we put together. There's the white, there's the white, there's the red. The blue doesn't look that visible, but under conditions of illumination, it's pretty nice. One study we did, it's very difficult to do field research when the weather changes and sunlight changes. So we got access to the Buffalo County Extension Building. They let us get in there, park a couple vehicles, this is a State Patrol vehicle, and turn off all the lights and just illuminate them with the headlights. So the control condition, what we did, a technique in classic psychology, since I'm a classic psychologist by some of my colleagues, classically trained, magnitude estimation. One suggestion is that without markings, it's difficult to estimate the distance between the viewer and the vehicle. And the easiest way to do that, a very reliable way, is to have the viewer assign a number to that distance. And typically that psychophysical function, the numbers assigned and the distance they are, is linear in this case. For line length and for distance measures, there's a linear relationship. Otherwise, you'll need to look at long relationships. In this case, Tom Knott was involved in this. And you can see with the headlights, the markings on the back lobe. And it's also true for the blue. Not bad. And so what we found is that the markings do work in dark conditions. And this is both Battenberg markings. We found that there really wasn't much of a difference between white and blue and red. They were all quite visible. White was a little bit more visible since it reflected more light. So those data were helpful to them. And this study, basically done in a semester with a lot of running around the Buffalo County Extension Building, and was done with Tom Knott and another student. I'll list them all at the end. Here we are on the driving range at the Safety Center. And what I didn't realize as we were working on this is that when we take pictures in the fall, the shadows change quite rapidly, as do the background, especially when a coal train goes zipping by. And so it was a time-consuming process to get decent photos. In this case, what we have is we went with a red and white chevron pattern on the back of this. And we were using, I believe the next is doing a change blindness study to see if you change from one scene to another scene. Come on, you can do it. All right, there's without the markings. Huh? Can't do that. It won't go. That's all right. And what we have is we want no markings to markings, and you flip through it. You present one picture, maybe for about a quarter of a second, a blank slide in between, and then the second changed picture, and you look at the sensitivity to the change, like we had with the jet on the aircraft carrier. And we looked at other changes, such as door open, door closed, brake lights on, brake lights off. and then removing the reflective material was noticed most easily in that regard. That was not an amazing result, but in fact, it was an application of a laboratory technique in the field. I put this here because we also had a brilliant idea, which failed miserably in the field. One student who was working with me, Shelley Cole, her husband was a police officer, and he might still be in a different small town. And he made this observation that when he is following cars on radar and he's parked, that he can track their speed as the cars are coming toward him, but when he becomes conspicuous to the driver, the speed goes down. So how far away that change occurs would be a neat measure of conspicuity. Jamie loaned us a radar gun, not that one, but and taught us how to use it. He had the students learn how to read the readings, which is a little bit tricky. And I'll never forget this. The straight line course in the safety center is about a quarter mile. And we had both of our police cruisers there, NSP cruisers. And so they were measuring, I was driving it, they were measuring my speed. And Jamie said, no, you need to go faster. And so he got in the cruiser and showed off a little bit, went into a four-wheel drift at the end and got up to about 65 miles an hour in a quarter mile and was able to stop safely. So this project was done. What we figured, and there's lots of very straight roads in Nebraska. And so we got to a straight road, we parked a marked state patrol vehicle, and as cars were coming toward us, first thing is our sample size was very small. We didn't have a lot of cars coming down these roads. And if you have two cars, you've got a problem in distinguishing between the two using the radar gun. We had 3 students in a state patrol vehicle that was marked with a radar gun. And one of the first people that we were able to get data on, he pulls over next to them and says, "What are you kids doing?" He noticed it, but the data just could not be collected. That was Steve Bales, was one of the students doing that, and he's one of our past non-traditional students. Even though he was not an 18, 20-year-old, it didn't work. So the speed trap study, good idea, and maybe now as radar guns have improved, maybe it would be possible to do that. As a matter of fact, over by Fountain Hills, they have a radar setup. And the other aspect of this, though, which also made it very difficult, which is why we had 3 students doing it, is you need to mark on the highway the distance away from the vehicle so that you can make a mark as to when their speed goes down and note the distance. And it turned out to be quite a task for those students who just unable to get very much good data out of it. Good idea, though, I think. Ken Tranker, he also bit the bait and did a really neat research study not on the interstate, but viewing the interstate. He found a section of the interstate, not a tough find, that was straight. And he positioned a camera at a perpendicular angle to the interstate and recorded cars as they're driving by. And here's some of the more technical stuff. This is all his magic that he did. And was able to, with that camera, determine the location. By the way, there's a second camera on a bridge overlooking the interstate. So given data from the 2 cameras, he was able to determine the speed, the change in speed, and the lane change, when the lane change happened with the vehicles. He found data like this. Here's an example of from the bridge cam. There's our state patrol vehicle pulled off. You can say the state troopers did not like being pulled off on the shoulder with no lights on. They didn't like being pulled off over there, period. And you get the FedEx truckers moving over, and Ken was able to determine with a non-marked or the old markings for the state patrol, almost half did not change, 52% decreased their speed, and yet 1% increased their speed. And it led him to a hypothesis that maybe there's two kinds of drivers, and in human factors it's called sheep and wolves. Here's what the new markings, it seemed to be better. Many more were decreasing their speed, and more had no change in their speed, and there were no wolves in this sample. It's a median sample of cars who just happened to be going down the highway at the time. Here's his conclusions. If you broke down on the interstate, 35% of the traffic will still be in the right-hand lane. Very dangerous. All right. Conclusion 2, oh Lordy, only 1 out of 5 will slow down a little in daytime conditions. Be careful out there. And then the new graphics caused more motorists to change lanes. So there was an increase in the visibility given those new graphics on the bumpers. I'll show you what they ended up looking like. Conclusion 3, 2 populations of drivers, and he had more data. He did this in the dead of winter. It was damn cold out there, and I admire him for sticking with it. But basically, the 2 kinds of drivers, just to make a linkage to some current changes, you've probably seen the countdowns on the side of the road when you have the hand don't cross and then has a countdown in 15, 14, 13 seconds, the light's going to change. 2 things have happened. One is, yes, there are more people who will slow down and stop before the caution light goes on. The second thing that's happened, there are more rear-end accidents because someone will slow down and the person behind will be a wolf and try to beat the yellow light. And I think that's more evidence in terms of driving style of people who in fact are wolfish in their driving approach. By the way, being a wolf is adaptive. If you ever driven the the Dan Ryan Expressway in Chicago during rush, you don't live unless you're a wolf. You have to basically be aggressive. All right, Rick Schuessler. We passed all of this stuff to Rick Schuessler, and he had some students. He worked with students, and he was primarily responsible for the new designs. Here are 3 colors: white in the middle, silver on the left, and black. The contrast is best for the black vehicles, and you can see that that's really good. In order to increase the contrast of the white and the silver, he did the shadowing. The thing that I really like is he avoided chevron and Battenberg with a different kind of a version of the chevron, where in fact you have kind of pointing to either side, away. Notice how the reflective material wraps around this. He also did some work on the sides. He changed the complete design of the side. Notice how it kind of flows nicely in that, and all of this is retroreflective material. He even changed the emblem a little bit here. A story behind what some of the state laws are is that, let's go back one, is that this 2-inch high labeling on the back bumper, rumor has it that a certain state legislature was getting too many speeding tickets between Omaha and Lincoln because there were unmarked state patrol cars that would catch that person. And so a law was made that we're not going to have any unmarked state patrol vehicles. I don't know. I don't know if that's true or not. Trace, is that true? Okay, well, some state troopers felt it was true, and that Bernie didn't like getting tickets. Okay, so we had a rollout for these. It was quite a show at the Safety Center. You can get an idea here of the wraparound nature of these things. And basically, the State Patrol had a half dozen cars with those markings. Grand Island Troop, North Platte Troop, and you occasionally would see them. They really were lovely. Also, though, what happened, the move over law took effect. And so in 2009, Nebraska joined other states in making it a law that if you see an emergency vehicle on the side, you have to change lanes unless you're blocked in. The other, and this is the more unfortunate aspect of this applied research, the company who made the decals, took them a long time to put it together, and either the glue was defective, but the decals were so thick that water could get behind them. And as the State Patrol vehicles were moving, they would blow off. So, probably 5 years ago, not used anymore. That's life, I guess, in the big city, or in Nebraska. It's not for everybody, you know. Okay, well, so I continued on with something that's called the moth effect. And this effect is reported in anecdotes by just about every police officer I talked to. Many others swear that it happens, including my old roommate from Notre Dame who was a pilot in the Navy. It's called the firefly effect, where if you have a flashing light in the periphery of a pilot or a driver, that there's a tendency not only to look at the light, but to very subtly drift toward the light. There's not a lot of data. Cy Cannon is over here, and the research seems to indicate that we can't get it into the lab. But if you look at the various conditions that might cause the moth effect, impaired driving, dim lighting, a whole variety of things, we're continuing the search for the moth effect. It's basically, in the Navy, it's called the firefly effect. When pilots learn how to land on aircraft carriers, there's what's called the ball, which is a light that flashes and gives them their position relative to the glide path they need not to crash. And common error that's supposedly made in Navy pilots is they drift too close to the ball, which is very similar to this. So, two last studies to describe. This is done with Lacey Johnson 2 years ago at the Safety Center. And you want to talk about research done on the cheap. We're pretty proud of this. We basically borrowed the Gator that we can drive at the Safety Center, and had students drive down the middle of this lane. But you can't see it here, but the middle of the lane has two pieces of concrete, and there's a crease there. So we set up all sorts of flashing lights in the side and measured their drift as the students were driving straight ahead in the Safety Center. We were able to measure their drift from the center line by taking a GoPro camera and pointing it down at the center line. Talk about a dreary way to do data collection. Lacey had to go in and actually get a standard to measure how far to the right or left the person went. We were going to try to buy a GPS system, but it simply did not have the acuity we needed in order to measure the drift. So we used the camera to measure that. Another interesting aside was we had set it up. We bought a strobe light for her car in the back window. And at a faculty staff club, Chief Davis came in, and I was describing to him this study. And I said, you know, ideally we would have a patrol car with all the lights on. He said, just come on down, we'll give you one. Not permanent. but he gave me, I go down there to the safety, to the campus police. They toss me the keys, and I learn a little bit about the point of view of police officers driving a vehicle that has lights on and has some authority. Very different than being a college professor. One thing that Lacey gave us, and this was kind of an interesting notion to categorize the kinds of distractions that drivers might be facing, is she distinguished between internal and external sources of distraction. Internally, on the cell phone, by the way, the classic study was done by David Strayer, University of Utah, where he found that talking on a cell phone and driving in a simulator, multi-million-dollar simulator, was just as disruptive to their driving skill as being drunk. And this study was, it's got to be true because it was done in Utah. And so, and the big issue since then has been texting in driving, because of course you're going to have to put your eyes on the screen. But it's just as disruptive to be on the cell talking to someone, because it takes your attention and it distracts you from having your attention, your spotlight of attention on the task you're doing. And so basically what Lacey gave us is kind of a nice conceptualization of distraction. There are distractions that occur in the vehicle, changing the station, yelling at your kids in the back seat, a whole variety of things, versus distractions that are occurring outside of the vehicle, which is what we were looking at. We combine, in this study, we combine internal distraction by having our students answer some questions on their cell phone while trying to navigate the course. Turns out the course was just too easy, and we needed to make it more complicated. Driving a straight line course, we had some turns, so it was more difficult to operate the vehicle. It might have led to some more results. But this is where, in fact, being out at the safety center, doing field work is no fun, because we had several instances where we needed to add a lot of weight to the barriers that we had out there because it was so damn windy and so cold. That's the moth effect. And finally, what's going on now with Psi, I put this up here because we did a visual search task. And in a sense, the moth effect, so what they argue in the moth effect is that it's going to draw your attention to the strobe light, to the light itself. And the logic with the Momo study, and I found, my daughter bought me a copy of this, and it's very cute, and I'll show you one, is the reason I have this up here is you're supposed to find this dog. This dog is highly trained to go sit and look at the camera, and the photographer goes out and takes pictures of the dog in various settings. So, again, my little brain said, well, isn't that visual search? And in this case, what we can do is put on a strobe in the visual field where they're looking for the dog, and then measure their time and their accuracy in finding the dog. So I did the programming for that. Here's an example. Let's see if you can find Momo. It's a hard one. Got Momo? This is really a difficult one. It's one of the harder ones we found. Momo is right down here. And everyone, whenever they see that, say, oh yeah, that's right. And it's an interesting version of a visual search task. Our students loved it. I think they were all positive when they went through it. And it's one of those things where you can bring it into the laboratory. Now, the question I have is this comparable to driving? Is this comparable to seeing on the side a strobe light? Good question, I don't know. But it certainly adds a lot of control to the situation, bringing it into the lab. The last thing we did is, so I wanted to learn how to do 3D simulations and he developed a program, and as a matter of fact, now the cost of some things, for $300 we have a steering wheel and a brake and a gas pedal, and he developed a 3D simulation of driving down a road, and we can place emergency vehicles in the side. This software also allows them to vary the speed and gives them their position in the lane very accurately over time. So we have a ton of data. What we had to do is to restrict the data in terms of dividing up how close they were to the distraction on the side, and do 500 pixels versus 50, I think, is that right? And do that analysis where you have not only the control, this is a emergency vehicle with no lights on, and you can put the lights on this in the simulation. If you want to drive it, come by and we'll set you up and let you drive on a simulator. Not as expensive as David Strayer's, but certainly as useful. Maybe we can get the mom effect out of this. Finally, Jamie Balthazar was the trooper who had the initial idea. I gotta blame him for years of work. Colonel Ryan Tuma was in charge of the State Patrol, and I wrote all my reports for him. Ken Trantham, Rick Schusler, Sherry Morrow all cooperated very nicely. And 10 students worked with me. Size at the top, Lacey and Shelley were the major players. That's what carried. And the rest were kind of either failed projects or assisted, very capable. So I'm done. I don't have any words of wisdom other than this is pretty obvious, but we have data to look at how you can, well, if you get a flat tire on the side of the interstate, I don't know what you should do. Pray or something. Questions? How did I do? Ooh, one longer. Nobody?
Girl back there always has a question. See, you deviated from, do you have any questions for me?
Oh.
Right? It's just like, ask me
You
questions.
can't leave unless you ask 2 questions.
Is it 2 questions?
That's my new strategy. Pardon?
5 points apiece for the question.
No, you just can't leave.
Oh.
But who wants can get a drink.
So, have you found that the State Patrol has changed their guidelines in how they apply decals to cars over time, or are they only using black cars now with high contrast and white
Rick
reflection?
Schusler, Rick Schusler did that wonderful
design for Dodge Chargers. It turns out they have pickup trucks, they have vans, they have trucks. And so for a while he was traveling to Lincoln to try to make it as similar so that their livery had a similar look to it across all the vehicles. But no. And with applied research like this, they're subject to costs and the mood of whoever's in charge. So it isn't one where there's a standard that we can just tinker with at all.
I keep wanting to call the gorilla.
It's distracting, isn't it? Nobody else?
Oh, there we go. Kurt.
There you go. You're on your cell phone already? No, you're on your. Were there any other similar type studies that you found, or national studies? I can't imagine that this is a one-off.
Yeah. A lot of the studies many of the studies were done in tech reports, so it's very difficult to get at them. And of course, the studies were done in field research. It's one of those things where if they bring it into the lab, you can see the limited applicability of it. And as a result of the studies, and an engineer scratching his head, they developed guidelines. So, for example, one of the guidelines I know for the State Patrol is they have to have 3 levels and a half but they designed their vehicles with 3 levels of strobe. There'll be a strobe up at the bar, a strobe in the back window, and typically a strobe at the license plate level. Now, God knows why, other than an engineer scratched his head and said, oh, that's a good idea. And there are some general principles. One is red lights are visible. Blue is better. Blue is better in daylight. And so there's a transition to both red and blue or all blue lights. And let's see, white lights, there's a problem there in that white lights tend to be at dusk and at night almost too bright, so they can blind the driver. So there's a cost benefit with regard to those kinds of designs. And so it basically is personalized by unit, by department. All right, wow.
All right.
Anything else?
Who's next? Is there going to be an interesting speaker next month?
Totally. We're gonna get to that. I have a question for you.
Okay.
So you were one of the original 18 who started this organization here. That means you haven't been a member before that.
Oh, I was.
Where did you become a member? And when was that?
At Miami,
I was an associate member of Miami of Ohio, and when we had our founding organizational meeting, I called my advisor and says, I don't know why you're still an associate, you should have been a full member. And so that was processed really quickly. But I've been a member since probably 74. So I don't want to subtract.
All right. Well, on that note, we have a little gift for you from the organization.
You can open it up later.
We just wanted to recognize you, honor you
Go ahead.
for.
no, am I conspicuous enough?
Don't be too conspicuous. There's something nice in there. But we wanted to recognize you for your service here to this
Thank you.
organization, for keeping it alive when it is on life support. We are certainly a very active chapter. The main organization has recognized us multiple times for that.
Yeah.
And on that note, our next speaker is a Sigma Xi distinguished national lecturer that we got funding to bring in. She'll be here 2 weeks from today. And that talk will actually be at 7 p.m. on the UNK campus, Copeland Hall, room 142. June Pilcher talking about that tricky brain. So, health psychologist from Clemson University, and we're bringing her here to give a talk. So,
For all of you who don't believe psychology is science, our Sigma Xi science honorary speaker is at Clemson in the Department of Psychology.
there we go. So, any plans for tonight in 2 weeks? Bill, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.